It's frustrating enough that America suffers from so many problems, but what makes the situation truly infuriating is just how incredibly simple the solutions to those problems are. So many of the disasters, from the unaffordability crisis to debt to inflation, that we've been told are unresolvable and inevitable, have fixes so obvious it's insane they have to be said out loud. They just happen to come from outside the window of fashionable, polite opinion that exists between the viewpoints of CNN and Fox News, which means they're never discussed or presented to the public. Until now. Today we'll talk about two of these problems and their obvious, but extremely unpopular, solutions. You're listening to The Conservative Rebel. Problem 1. No one can afford anything. Solution 1. So stop stealing their money and making it worthless. One of the worst problems American society faces today is the affordability crisis. The price of groceries, gas, housing, rent, cars, education, healthcare, and just about everything else has skyrocketed recently. And at the same time as government inflation drives the prices of literally everything up, wages remain stagnant. Americans are saddled with car debt, high mortgages, six-figure college debt, and thousands of dollars of additional credit card debt with insane, rapidly snowballing interest rates. Home ownership, which is necessary for the survival of any functional civilization, and was once a key part of the American dream, is increasingly unattainable. In 1960, the average first-time home buyer was in his early 20s. Today, the average first-time home buyer is nearly 40 years old by conservative estimates. We are rapidly approaching the World Economic Forum's dystopian dream of own nothing and be happy. Minus the be happy part, of course. In short, our economic system is failing. And it's failing spectacularly. And no one is more affected by it than young people who are just getting started out in life. Unsurprisingly and inevitably, this has had a radicalizing effect on them. They know they're being systematically screwed, and increasingly they have shifted the blame for it onto capitalism. What we really need, people are beginning to think, is more regulation and more government intervention in the economy. They've been told by older conservatives that the system they're living under is capitalism, and so they can't criticize it or they're ungrateful, entitled socialists. And many of them are beginning to think, well, if this is capitalism, what's so great about capitalism? If I can't criticize this, I guess I'm not a capitalist then. But this isn't capitalism. This isn't free markets. And the reason no one can afford anything isn't because the government isn't powerful enough. The reason no one can afford anything is because the government steals ridiculous amounts of our incomes at gunpoint and then sucks the value out of whatever pocket change they let us keep through inflation. No one can afford anything because the government has deliberately stolen so much of their money and has deliberately created an environment where things are increasing in prices dramatically because of inflation. The reason we are in this crisis isn't because the government is too relaxed, but because the government is far too involved in the economy. Taxes, or in other words, the government, is consistently a top 3 expense for American families. Taxes are a greater expense than groceries and than gas and than most other things you spend money on. And yet the government never ends up getting any blame for it. How is that possible? Well, when you add up all the different taxes you have to pay, the income tax, the sales tax, the gas tax, the capital gains tax, the property tax, excise taxes, utility taxes, about half of all the money you make is stolen from you by the government. Around half of it. Think about that for a second. That means that for half of your career, you're not working for yourself or for your family. You're working to make the money you'll pay in taxes against your will at gunpoint. You don't want to pay taxes. You don't want to have to spend half your career working to pay taxes. Who does? And what do they call working against your will? Being forced by someone else to work involuntarily. They call it slavery. For half of your career, because of federal, state, and local taxes, mostly federal taxes, you and almost everyone else in this country is a slave. You work 6 months out of the year as a slave to the feds. You spend half of your adult life in bondage. Here's another way of looking at it. If you're married and both you and your spouse work, one of you is only working to pay off your taxes. One of you is a full-time slave. One of you is toiling 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, around 260 days a year in slavery. Either way you look at it, this is a moral abomination. It is armed robbery and enslavement. And you can't resist it. You're powerless to say no. Because if you do, guess what? Armed government agents will come to your door, seize your property, and lock you in a cage. Your life is ruined forever. So on top of being extremely unethical, this tax system that we currently have is sucking the lifeblood out of our economy. It is taking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars away from Americans that they no longer get to spend on buying that house that they could have gotten 15 years earlier if we lived in a slightly saner society. They can't spend that money on paying off the debt that they really have been working really hard to try to pay off because the credit card companies scammed them, because the colleges scammed them. The reason they can't do that is because of the government. And this is just talking about what the government directly steals from you. Because there's another way they can squeeze even more money out of struggling American families. Like they're wringing out a wash rag, and they're folding it in half again and again and squeezing harder, trying to get every last drop out of it. That's what they're doing to us. And that's through inflation. As the economist Henry Hazlitt wrote, quote, "Inflation itself is a form of taxation. It is perhaps the worst possible form, which usually bears hardest on those least able to pay. Most people think inflation is either an inevitable fact of human existence, or something that even well-intentioned governments will inevitably create accidentally. But viewing it that way is entirely wrong. It's far closer to the truth to view inflation as a sinister conspiracy to transfer purchasing power from the working class to the government and a handful of politically connected elites. Because it turns out that's pretty much what it is. Before we get into how sinister it is, let's make sure we understand what inflation is, what causes it, and how it works. Inflation essentially means that the paper money everyone is forced to use through legal tender laws loses some or all of its value. That means that the prices of everything go up. If there's a 10% inflation, which means a 10% increase in the money supply, that means money becomes 10% less valuable, which means you'll have to pay 10% more money in order to get the same things you would have had to pay 10% less money to get before. And the thing that causes this is the government printing money. Printing more money increases the supply of money. And due to supply and demand, the higher the supply of something, the lower demand for each individual unit of that thing will be. The lower the demand, the lower the value. This works for US dollars just like everything else. The more US dollars the government prints, the less valuable each individual dollar will become. That means each dollar won't buy as much as it used to. Now, this actually wouldn't be a problem if the money supply increased for everyone in the same way. If prices went up 10% for everyone, but everyone had 10% more money, then there wouldn't be much of an issue. But that's not the way things work. Money the government prints isn't put into the economy until the moment the government spends it. That means the government gets to use the money before the supply of money in the market has gone up, because they're introducing it to the market when they spend it. Which means they get to use the money before it loses its value. By the time the new money has actually caused the value of the dollar to go down, to the full extent that it will, it's already passed through the government's hands and likely a chain of politically connected elites' hands, all of whom used the new money that was being printed to benefit off of it. But the least politically connected, everyday Americans, get no benefit from the new money. They only get the harmful effects of inflation. The only thing they get is a higher grocery bill, whereas the most politically connected elites get a new sports car, or whatever they're gonna buy with it. Henry Hazlitt puts it this way, quote, "The process of inflation is certain to affect the fortunes of one group differently from those of another. The first groups to receive the additional money will benefit the most. The money incomes of Group A will have increased before prices have increased. When the money incomes of Group A have already increased 30%, the prices of the things they purchase haven't increased at all yet. By the time the money incomes of Group B have increased 20%, prices have still increased an average of only 10%. When money incomes of Group C have increased only 10%, however, prices have already gone up 15%. And when money incomes of Group D have not yet increased at all, the average prices they have to pay have gone up 20%. In this way, inflation transfers wealth from the working class to the government and a small circle of wealthy elites really close to the government. It's a secretive tax that allows the government to take away people's money without them even realizing it. This is the root cause of the government affordability crisis. Not capitalism run amok, not greedy corporations. Greedy corporations are a problem, but that's not the root cause. The root cause is that the government steals half of everything people earn directly and then inflates whatever money it lets them keep into worthlessness. It really does come down to that. But the solution to this crisis, though it is a massive crisis, is incredibly simple. If the government were to, say, stop stealing people's money, or at least drastically reduce the amount of their money it stole, then every working-class American would effectively get a massive wage increase of tens of thousands of dollars a year with no negative side effects at all. Those thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, whatever it ended up being, could be spent on buying groceries, paying off debt, buying homes, starting businesses, and a million other things that benefit our culture and economy. If the government were also to end the unconstitutional paper money inflation scam they've been running since 1913 and return to the gold standard our Constitution requires, then prices would stabilize or even go down. Everything would become far more affordable, and countless recessions and depressions caused by inflation would be avoided. The wealth transfer from the working class to politically connected elites would end, and the playing field would finally be level for everyone to prosper in the free market. But that will never happen for one reason: the insane amount of money our government spends, which leads us to problem 2. The debt crisis and impending national bankruptcy. And solution 2. Stop lighting money on fire. America's debt crisis is an existential threat to the survival of the U.S. government, but most people don't know anything about it. And even if they do have some vague knowledge that it's real and it's a problem, they haven't taken the time to let it sink in. So let me explain. America's national debt has reached $38 trillion. That's 38 followed by 12 zeros. That's enough money to stretch from Earth to the moon and back 7,000 times. That's enough money to encircle the entire globe in dollar bills 140,000 times. Yes, with our debt, you could give our planet visible rings like Saturn has, made out of literal cash. $38 trillion is a number most people can't fathom. You can try to come up with illustrations like this, but they're still so extreme and absurd, they're hard to imagine. Unless you have a PhD in astrophysics and are used to exploring the extremities of black holes with pure math, you can't wrap your mind around a number like that. So let's make it a bit more personal. Uncomfortably personal. There is one and only one way the government can ever pay off this debt. There is one and only one way it can get the money it needs to do that. And that's to steal that money from Americans. That is to say, to take the money from you. It can either directly steal your money from you through taxes, or it can cunningly and secretively steal the value from your money by inflating the currency. Either way, the government has to actively make it harder for you to afford things, and actively make your life worse to pay for any of its expenses, including this massive debt, without exception. So, if you pay taxes, your share of this debt is $264,000. To pay this debt off, that's how much money the government would have to steal from you and every other taxpayer in America. If you're married and your spouse also pays taxes, your family's share is over $500,000. But most likely, you won't personally be forced to choke up that $264,000 or however much more it ends up being by the time you die. Your children and your grandchildren will. Every dollar the government spends beyond what it takes in isn't just money stolen from you. It's money stolen from future generations, who we're sentencing to live under a catastrophic depression and the total collapse of our monetary system. And this collapse might come sooner than any of us want to imagine. Our debt is so large that one of the single biggest projects the government spends money on is just making interest payments on it. We spent almost another $1 trillion just on interest payments last year. On top of that, the government spent $2 trillion total, more than it took in last year. We are going trillions of dollars further into debt to temporarily pay off our already unpayable $38 trillion debt. We're in a vicious death spiral. We're like a spaceship approaching a black hole. It gets harder and harder to escape its grasp the closer you get, until eventually you cross the event horizon and reach the point of no return. We're heading toward that event horizon, and fast, if we're not already there yet. So you can take out your notepad if you've got one handy and add debt crisis to your personal list of apocalyptic disasters to worry about. But fortunately, this crisis has a very simple solution. Stop lighting money on fire. To instantly stop any further damage, all the government has to do is not spend more money than it takes in. This is a very simple principle. You go into debt when you spend more money than you take in. When you spend more money than you have. So all the government has to do to avoid this problem is limit its spending to the stunning $5.2 trillion that it took in last year. That's how much money it takes in every year, about $5 trillion. Limiting your spending to $5 trillion, I don't feel like that's unreasonable. I don't feel like that's too much to ask. It's a bar so unbelievably low that it's thousands of feet below the surface of our Earth. But the government is so unbelievably bloated and wasteful that it somehow finds a way to spend itself into bankruptcy despite having $5.2 trillion to work with every year. To avoid this, we need to cut at least $2 trillion from the federal budget so that we're no longer spending more than we take in. And as important as cutting waste, fraud, and abuse is important and necessary, that alone is not close to enough. There is one and only one way to cut trillions of dollars, to cut that much money. You can't just cut fat, you have to cut some meat. And that's very unpopular with the voters. The solution to this will be very, very unpopular, because it means you have to slash welfare spending and also, inevitably, some military spending, which are the government's two largest expenses. Now, to sufficiently cut welfare in order to reduce the national debt, we can't just target a couple of extremely obvious fraudsters like 300-year-olds on Social Security and stuff like that. We should kick all of those people off. There's no reason to keep paying them money, and we should prioritize kicking them off, but that alone is just a tiny percentage of what welfare money is spent on. Millions of real people will have to have their welfare benefits terminated. And that's not because those millions of real people are necessarily all fraudsters, but the fact is a lot of them are not working. They are not trying to find a job. They are perfectly able-bodied, but they refuse to seek work, so their welfare benefits should immediately be terminated. Anyone who is on drugs should have his welfare benefits immediately terminated. On our food stamps program, over 2/3 of the people who are on it, around 2/3 of them, are overweight or obese, which means they are definitionally not in danger of starving to death, which is what the entire purpose of the food stamp program is for. So we should cut food stamps for all of the people who are just shirking it, and for the people who stay on it, we should limit it. Instead of letting them buy junk food, which is what we're currently doing, it should be like meat and potatoes and vegetables and rice and fruit and veggies. Like, that should be all you can buy. The bare necessities of keeping you alive. But we're going to have to cut more than that, too. There's so much that we're going to have to cut, and unfortunately, it's going to have to affect real people, some of whom are not shirkers. It doesn't mean we necessarily have to abolish all of welfare in order to reduce the national debt, but a great deal of it does have to be abolished. A great deal of it does have to be privatized and handed over to the states and to private charities and stuff. We just cannot afford to keep doing this. And for those people who are genuinely struggling, but the welfare system has to be cut, they will actually be struggling a lot less if we don't have this debt crisis, if we don't have this inflation crisis, if we don't have these insanely high taxes. If you separate the emotion from the situation and truly examine it, the problem of the working class and the problem of financially struggling people is the government. The government is not the solution to their problems. If we can get the government to stop screwing the economy, then those people will have a much easier time of things. And that means that less people will need to be on welfare in the first place. I'm sorry. I know it will be very painful. I'm not comfortable with it either. But we don't have the money to afford this. We're going bankrupt. It's this or it's bankruptcy. It's this or it's the Great Depression 2.0. It means we have to seriously rein in the empire. We need to declare victory and end the war with Iran immediately. We killed the Ayatollah. Great. Let's get out. Let's say we've won. Let's not turn this into a quagmire. We need to terminate all foreign aid to all countries, including Ukraine and Israel, immediately. And yes, we need to cut the military, too. I know that's a sensitive spot for conservatives, but we already spend hundreds of billions more on the military every year than both Russia and China combined. So some of this just isn't necessary, and it has to be cut if we want to balance the budgets. So I'm sorry, just like the welfare scenario, it's this or it's bankruptcy. It's this or it's the Great Depression 2.0. We simply cannot continue to go on like this. In short, the debt crisis, like the affordability crisis, has an incredibly simple solution. That solution just happens to be one most voters right now are too squeamish for. But the clock is ticking. If we want America to survive, we have to act now. Or else. On that happy note, thanks for listening to today's episode of The Conservative Rebel. Please leave a review, share it with anyone you think might like it. I'll see you next time.